So, Magnus, I have a question for you to kick off our Halloween series, as it were.
Ooh, go ahead.
What kind of person do you envision you'd be if you were born on October 31st?
Ooh, I don't know. The thing is though, I don't know whether the exact date matters because the core of myself would still be the same. I would probably have much more of an awareness of Halloween when I was younger, I suppose, and perhaps I would have leaned far more heavy into it than I do now. Hmm. It's a troublesome question. What sort of person do you think you would be if you were born on the same date?
Well, the reason that I ask is it's actually
Hmm.
quite important to the story that we're going to be talking about today, because William Holloway and Jim Nightshade were both born on opposite ends of October 31st, essentially. Will was born a minute before and Jim a minute after, and it actually colors their personality throughout all of this very terrifying children's story that Ray Bradbury wrote.
Hmm. Yes, I remember it being the crux of the film. Um, Very much the sort of driving narrative point, um, but certainly not the driving narrative theme. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, it's also very present in the book, but the book is different enough from the film that they're kind of two different experiences,
Mm,
which is pretty cool, I think. They have two very different narrative devices, but they complement each other well. You can tell Ray Bradbury had his hand in the film, even though the film took a very long time to make. And it's one of
mm,
the projects he's most proud of adaptation wise. So
yes, did a bit more background reading and research before our conversation today, and oh boy, this had a bit of a troubled production. So,
I'm kind of glad Gene Kelly didn't get to make it because Gene
mm,
Kelly is a very specific type of person, but I can't envision him doing this kind of nightmare fuel. This is the kind of nightmare fuel that ended up on Clive Barker's list of it was like the top four best story about good and evil in Clive Barker's list.
mm.
Yeah,
Ooh. How fascinating. I didn't realize about that, but I can see why it did so, considering sort of how almost primal some of the elements of fear that are in this film come across. It's a sort of like unsettling sort of fear that sticks with the viewer after they've watched something.
yeah, and I think it's partially because a coming of age story, a really good one, is something that none of us can escape. And I think
Mm,
something wicked this way comes is probably one of the best, if not the best example of a coming of age story that was not written by Stephen King to be a spooky coming of age story, I suppose. I know Stephen King also loves. Stephen King has mentioned The Dark Carnival in at least The Dead Zone. Um,
mm,
and things like Salem's Lot and Needful Things kind of ape some of the stuff from Something Wicked. So
mm.
yeah,
So you chose this theme, well, the subject, shall I say, for this
yes,
episode today. Um, so in good spirits, I think you should lead on maybe that bring across why you wanted to choose this today
yes.
and perhaps why it sticks in your memory so strongly for the theming of sort of like childhood fears and such as that.
Yes, I chose it because unlike the never ending story, where there's one element I'm really afraid of, Something Wicked This Way Comes has a whole bunch of elements that I fear. Seduction to the dark side, the idea of becoming blind overnight, the idea of being whisked away from everything you've known without knowing you're doing it, and also spiders, spiders that come out of lightning. I mean, I cannot express to you that the scene with the spiders, which is both in the book and the film, the film makes the spiders this very visceral presence, and spiders are a top 10 fear of almost everybody, I think. So
Mm,
that's where we'll start, is that this movie terrified me, and it's probably the darkest Touchstone picture Disney movie ever made. I think it might edge out Watcher in the Woods for darkest live action Disney movie ever made, for good reason.
mm. I just find it fascinating that you have a company such as Disney, which, on the surface level, portrays itself as the ultimate family-friendly fare, but it doesn't take much to scratch down and find all sorts of strange, weird, and random things that they've done in the past, and it's very much under their umbrella.
Oh
Um,
yeah, Disney's dark mythology goes all the way back to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
mm,
But yeah, Touchstone was created as an imprint specifically for films like Something Wicked This Way Comes and Splash. Even I think Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a Touchstone release,
mm.
more than it was a Disney release. And it's basically so they could play with the darker edges of the things they wanted to play with because they wanted to make more money. So it wasn't altruistic. Disney did not do anything altruistic in like making a imprint for their adult stuff. It was more the practicality of like we want the money, but we don't want to say this is from Disney just in case. So and considering how long Something Wicked took in production hell, I can only imagine the conversation about it in the executive boardroom.
Mm, indeed. Um, it looks it wasn't just time, it was also money. It looks like they had to do quite a bit of additional work, and this was back in the day when, yes, they would have to do reshoots and things, but like expensive reshoots are very much more of an indicative of today's cinematic culture when they're trying to get it just right to get the audience in the seats and buying the subscriptions. Um, for I don't know how big how how do I put this? I don't know how mainstream release this was. Was this one of the films that they wanted just to put out on TV and cable, or did this actually get a cinematic release?
I think because it was touted as a Bradbury story specifically, and Jonathan Pryce was involved, who was
Mm,
not big at the time, but this is his best known role for me, essentially. Um, I think this was done in theaters, and it was probably a late summer release to gear up for um, Halloween. I didn't actually look that up, but it's definitely because this falls in the trilogy. This is part of the Green Town trilogy of Bradbury's work, and this is about the transition from summer to fall. This is about puberty and maturity. And so, specifically, Something Wicked, you have to release it close to the beginning of fall. It doesn't make sense to release it any other time of the year. Um,
I
yeah.
wasn't aware this was part of a trilogy. Is it an actual trilogy, or is it just sort of interconnect? Is there any connection between the other parts?
None of the characters from the other parts end up in Something Wicked This Way Comes, but I actually have to look it up because it's a whole bunch of stuff. But like, so Dandelion Wine is about spring into summer, Something Wicked is about summer into fall. And then what is the third one? Farewell Summer, which is, I think that's about fall into winter. You can get the story collection Summer Morning, Summer Night, I think has all the Greentown stories, but all of the stories in the trilogy take place in this small town.
Ah,
It's based on, I'm gonna butcher this name, so I apologize to all of our listeners, Waukegan, Illinois. It's based on the town where he grew up. So like when he does small town work, Ray Barry's small town work is almost always based on this weird idyllic Illinois rural thing. And you see it here. So
so thankfully it's got a stronger connection as a trilogy than the Cornetto ice cream trilogy did, which was the trilogy really just to name rather than did I get that right? The Cornetto ice cream trilogy, what was it? The one with Hot Fuzz, Shaun of the Dead, and Pub at
uh,
the
the
End of the World or something? No,
World's
it was
End, yeah, was the third
yes.
one. Um, so we don't have cornettos here. We've called them drumsticks, which we've had a conversation about in the past when we talked about, I think it was Hot Buzz.
Mm,
So we call it the Blood and Ice Cream trilogy, but it's like an unofficial thing. Yeah, the Cornetto trilogy is a trilogy, but World's End is so different that it doesn't even really fit into the trilogy itself. So,
mm. But what I'm trying to get at is it sounds like this trilogy actually has some proper connections, at least between the three different films.
oh
You know,
yeah,
if
and
even
yeah.
the setting.
And Bradbury is known for sort of his overarching world work. The Martian Chronicles is a good example of that, about how Earthlings go back and forth between Mars and what it means in different contexts. So it's the Halloween tree, which is a fairly well-known Bradbury property. I Sing the Body Electric, the one about the old couple that are serial killers that are constantly trying to murder each other. They're all pretty loosely interconnected just because of how he themes his body of work. So yeah.
Mm, excellent. Um, so in regards to this picture, um, is there any particular moments that really stand out starkly that you think help to make this film? I know you mentioned about tarantulas
Oh, it's
already.
not just one it's not just tarantulas. It's literally the beginning of the movie. A lightning rod salesman comes by the house where Jim and Will are playing together, and they're both going to turn 14, I think, or something like that. And he ends up giving one of them a lightning rod. And the night they get the attack by the spiders, like the lightning rod has broken, just like the night before, and they hadn't had a chance to fix it yet. And it's just part of this ongoing attack because of what they witness at the carnival.
Mm,
Not that they're maliciously trying to bring it down. It's not a Stranger Things thing, but just by them witnessing something they shouldn't see, the carnival sort of takes it upon itself to track them. What's
mm,
interesting is the book doesn't dive as deeply into this as the movie does. The movie makes it seem very much like it's about Jim, and it's about getting Jim to do like the son of Satan thing. Um, but really, the book is about Will, because the book is written almost as diary entries from him. And so we watch a lot of Will and Charles. That's more in the book than the film. But it's quite this interesting. They're such different styles of doing, but they tell almost the same story.
mm,
The idea that Mr. Dark is trying to get Jim to be his unofficial apprentice, to be kind of the next him, is a threat, but it's less of a problem in the book. That the movie makes
mm,
it a bigger subplot than I feel like it is in the book. It's not bad
mm.
by any stretch. It's just a choice. I don't know if that's the same choice I make. So
uh, yeah, so that what you were just saying about Mr. Dark trying to get Jim to become his sort of a successor, apprentice, and such. The aspect of seduction by offering Jim something that he wants. That reminds me of what you were saying before, like that fear of seduction by the dark.
yeah.
Um, it's not the only aspect of seduction within the film. In fact, if I recall correctly, there's quite a few instances and examples of seductive behavior, and it's not just towards Jim, but dare I say, tempting quite a lot of the townsfolk as well, and the threat of it.
Yeah, and this is something that's really cool because it's different. This is a great version of adaptation. If you read the book doesn't really have as much of the town in it. So the football player, the guy that gets turned into the bearded lady, um, they kind of exist, but because they are not Will's immediate family, we don't see as much of them in the book. It works really well, actually, if you're talking about it as a tale of seduction. What's interesting is, especially from a queer angle, that seduction is never taken in like a negative power play direction either. Um, you feel like the bearded lady punishment isn't about gender and queerness, but it's more about uncontrollable lust. So it doesn't feel as cringy as it could have felt in 1983, which is when this movie came out. So I am very grateful that even though they do it, it's not as negative as it could be. I'm very grateful. It's not as it could have been so much worse.
Hmm. Indeed. And then here's the thing. I think at the end of the day, this is very much a family horror movie, a family chiller, suspense thriller. Any elements that they're going to have, it's going to be done in such a way that it can terrify kids, leave a lasting impression with them, but it's never going to venture fully into, say, dare I say, adult territory, as
Yeah,
it were.
yeah,
And that is such a massive balancing act. Good kids' horror finds a way to create a sense of threat and peril, but doesn't do it in such a way that creates lasting trauma, shall we say.
yeah.
I mean,
Not like the banshee from Darby O'Gin's Little People. I still think about that banshee is still terrifying. The banshee of death that accompanies you. No, thank you. None of that. 0% of that.
indeed, you want to create something that will get kids really spooked, like
Yeah.
some of the stuff in like some of the stuff in Goosebumps was bordering on it sometimes.
Oh yeah. And
But you,
R.L. Stein loves this movie too. It's one of his
mm,
favorites. So yeah, definitely.
yeah, you just don't want to go to the extent where it terrifies children to the extent where the parents are writing in letters to the studio. That's the main point I was going with it. You don't want
Yeah.
the pitchforks literally in real life against the studio for this.
Yeah, and I think in '83, because Disney had done The Dark Crystal, people were kind of comfortable with things like Labyrinth. It wasn't such a big deal because Something Wicked wasn't the only film that had ever or would ever do this.
Mm,
It felt like people were more comfortable with kids and darkness in the '80s, and there's something about this movie that was so well written. The scene that occurs in both the film and the book, which is the scene where Mr. Dark has gotten the illustrated man to either illustrate or tattoo the faces of Will and Jim on his hands, on the palms of his hands, as he's like going through town and the carnival's doing a parade while looking for the boys. And the very tense scene where the kids are hiding in the storm drain, as kids are wont to do in the scenario. It's very kid focused, which makes it work. And Jim's dad, Charles, is outright lying to Mr. Dark about not having seen them. And Mr. Dark starts squeezing his hands, and the pictures start to bleed, and the kids' faces start to bleed a little bit, just enough. Not like full on gore, not full on carry, but just enough to know how much danger they're in, but that they'll be safe because the dad is there. And the dad's not willing to give them up. He's not willing to be seduced. It gets a little bit Christiany in about the end of the second act, but you can't fault Ray Bradbury for that. That was kind of the lexicon at the time. Um,
mm,
and it works. It doesn't ever fail heavy handed. It still works, but it's very much bad. Like there's bad in it. It's the trip of Christianity saving a lot of things, but it's like a subplot, so it's not so bad.
mm. Uh, There definitely is like a strong thread line of the peril of the adversary throughout this film and what dark represent. I mean, speaking of which, dark as the the surname is it, I would say that's slightly a bit on the nose, but I mean it works. It's very clear. Um, it doesn't have to be subtle. It could be nice
Yeah.
and straightforward.
And I
But
mean,
yes,
we hadn't had a character like Mr. Dark before.
mm,
The only character like Mr. Dark in children's cinema anywhere is the evil twin brother and We're Back, a Dinosaur story.
mm,
Like, we'd never really done kind of nightmare fuel carnival subverting the joy trope. Even Dumbo never touched it, really. So Mr. Dark was really quite one of a kind. There's a whole bunch of name changes that happen in the story in the carnival, which is really cool. Like Mr. Cougar, who ends up becoming Mr. Electrico, which is a nod to Ray Bradbury's childhood. I kind of like the changing of the name, the transition of people, in a way that is both terrifying but isn't played for laughs that would be like really soul crushing. It's terrifying, but it's terrifying in the way that you're terrified of things when you're a kid and on the cusp of puberty. It works really
Mm,
well.
yes. And I suppose that's the thing at the end of the day. Because it is a children's film and such, like the whole aspect of Jim being jealous about is it the minutes difference or was it 2 minutes? It's a minute before, a minute after, isn't it? With like
It's a
her.
thing where, yeah, because he was done a minute after, so he's closer. He wants maturity more, like he wants to grow up. His desire is not necessarily to be the heir to Mr. Dark. His desire is to just kind of grow up. He's impatient for it. And Mr. Dark exploits that, which is really cool. It's very subtle. It's really good masterwork in how to write
Mm.
subtle desire that then just gets out of control. You lose control of it, essentially.
And and the thing is, it's a realistic desire.
Yeah.
It's very much something that you would expect a child to kind of want. Like as an adult, it makes absolutely like minimal sense, like being jealous over a minute's difference as such. You might jokingly say, "Ah, I'm envious of you, John. I wish I'd been the one to be born this da da da." Etc. But as a kid, that makes perfect sense. And the whole aspect of growing up and everything, completely understandable, and
Yeah.
so it is a weakness that you can get, and you could see how he could be, dare I
I
say,
mean,
seduced.
I'd also want to be an Aries, so I understand you wanting to be an Aries. It's the best. We're the best sign. Um, what's interesting too about this idea of seduction is that Miss Foley is seduced, but Jim doesn't really witness the aftermath of her seduction. Everything that we see about her seduction is done through Will's eyes and through his dad's eyes, from Charles. Um, so Jim never gets to actually see what happens to Miss Foley. That's almost
Mm,
exclusively done through Will's point of view and through Will witnessing Mr. Cougar. Um, Will's the one that ends up in the demonic mirror maze, which is one of my favorite elements because mirror mazes are a real thing and they get very scary and claustrophobic. So it's super cool. Um, it's it's kind of a masterwork of how do we get Jim inching ever closer to that carousel that will age you or make you younger. Like it's a masterwork of getting there step by step. I think it works really nicely.
mm. Building suspense and building direct narrative direction and such.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it, it's perfect in that way. Oh, I had a point. I can't remember what it was going to be now. Um, like with all things, it will come back to me.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I remember now what I was gonna say. Another great thing about it is the fact you mentioned about Mr. Foley. The fact of seeing adults that you know and trust in your life, and seeing them being seduced by temptation and such as that. That in itself is quite a nice bit of subtle horror because of the fact you have sort of faith and you feel security from adults and knowing that they're older and hopefully wiser. To see them sort of like fall against this force as well would be very terrifying for a kid to be witnessing. And to feel that sort of safety being so taken away, which is probably why Charles managing to resist and deter um, Mr. Dark's advances had such a strong potency to it.
And that's something you don't get as much of in the movie. It's much more explicit in the book that Charles finding joy in who he is, even though he's an older father, is sort of thing that saves the story. It's something that makes the book slightly better in a way than the movie, I think, because the movie does kind of more of a Hollywood ending. It makes it more about the carousel um, than is really in the end of the story. and there's more about the idea of laughter and joy, and reaching out to Mr. Dark and saying, "We love you and we'll take care of you." And that it's sort of a market difference, but it just feels like a different version of the same story. It's not bad. It's an interesting, like, if you like adaptation, read something Wicked and then watch something Wicked, and like you can
Mm,
compare the two and see the exact moments where they were like, we need to add this because this is going to be a film. We need to give more room to the cast of characters. We need this to look a certain way. Even if you just look at the different book covers of the anniversary covers of Something Wicked This Way Comes, they're all so different because you can really do it from your point of view, which is super cool.
mm. And would you say that even though there's clear differences, the substance of the story remains quite clearly it's the same story despite the fact of having these differences? Is that quite clear?
I think it's quite clear. I think it's still at the heart of the story. It's about Will and Jim and how they go from being friends to how they have to confront the fact that they won't be friends.
Mm,
Like their attitudes are so different about life that even though they're friends now, in maybe a year, something is going to break them apart. Like, really, the core of the story is about the two of them. It is terrifying that we ever find out what happens to Miss Foley. In the book, she seems like she's scooped up by the circus, but in the movie, it's very ambiguous. Um,
mm,
but the story at the heart, the book story is more about Charles and Will and Jim. The movie makes it more about Will and Jim with Charles in a supporting role. So it's a little bit of a, how much do you want the dad to be involved? But he has his own journey to go on. But if you tell the story through the eyes of the kid, then he can't have all the screen time as the dad, because a kid only understands their dad a certain way, where they are in life, and it's a weird fine line. It's hard to explain. For people that haven't read it or seen it, it's something that you only notice by doing the act of both of those, and
mm,
both reading and seeing it.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Also, the
Mm,
dwarf isn't in the book. I was a little thrown by the inclusion of dwarves. I believe that's how they self-identify in the movie. That's not in the book, which is not bad. But it's just more of the othering. I can't tell if it accentuates the story or not, but it is just a thing to know.
it could very well be an example of the screenwriters and the people that were designing
Yeah,
the sets and such sort of asking themselves, what is my perception of what a carnival is and what a carnival has?
yeah,
And maybe having read the book as well to get some idea of what the elements were, what's in there, and it could just be a very clear example of in my perception,
yeah.
it had there is a dwarf or there is some dwarfs involved in this carnival. We have to throw our minds back because this film is about 40 years old now, isn't it? Or
Something like
something along
that.
those lines. Mm, even that doesn't sound like a huge amount of time, but even that space of time, definitely quite a difference in attitudes and like
Yeah.
perceptions compared to today. In fact, it'd
In
be great.
in yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
In Wikipedia is telling me that Tom Fury, who is a lightning rod salesman, is turned into a dwarf in the book, but I have no memory of that happening. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means it's less important to the book. Him being turned into something is an important moment because it makes the boy suspicious and starts the carnival hunting them down. But
Mm,
like, in the context of the movie, it's played very differently, and it's different in my memory. So
mm. Well, again, this is a great example of your
yeah,
memory of the story and some details being different to what you recall. And that will be the same with a number of people that have consumed the
yeah,
media.
and it's not bad. Like, there will be people that just get stuck on the spider machine, because for a long time that is where the movie ended for me, because I couldn't finish it. Um, I can't even remember, because I was born in '86, so the movie was 3 years old. Um, by the time I was born. So I don't remember when I actually saw it, but I have to imagine I saw it as a child because I loved Bradbury and I loved mysteries like the Boxcar Children. So I have to imagine someone showed it to me and I was terrified but enthralled by it. And I think terrified but enthralled is a great way to describe most of Ray Bradbury's. So
So, a point I wanted to touch on, um, towards the film's climax, there's a moment when Will is struggling himself, and he realizes it's the love for his father that allows him to resist the temptations and such,
sure.
and the love that his dad has to him. I want to ask you, do we have many examples where within like children's films, to be honest, in general, where it's clearly the love between a father and son that helps sort of save someone and against the dark, as opposed to some other means, something like the love I have for my partner and such. Because
Sure.
I think that that is a much rarer example, actually.
I think that is rare, and that's a really good point too, because a part of Jim's story is that Jim doesn't have a Charles. Will has a dad, even though he's older, which makes him other in the context of the story.
Hmm.
Jim doesn't have that at all that I can remember. I read the story recently, and I vaguely recall the idea that Jim just doesn't straight up have a dad, and so he uses Charles sort of as an erstwhile father. I could be wrong about that. If I'm wrong about that, please don't send me hate mail. I'm doing the best I can. But yeah, when I think about kids cinema, like in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it's the woman Truly who kind of gets Dick Van Dyke to sort of straighten up enough to rear his children. Brother Bear is about brothers. Moana a little bit. You could make a case for Moana, but that's a female protagonist. Um, it's not like there really isn't that. Like that's not a story that gets told very often, the father-son dynamic. And because we grew up in an age of sitcoms where every father was a buffoon and every son rolled their eyes every 10 seconds, it feels very pastiche. It feels like an ancient trope now, even though we haven't really had very much of it. Even Full House, it was like daughters and dads. So it's there's not much of it. I guess Boy Meets World, I would say the dad from Boy Meets World is maybe the strongest of the generation. Yeah, I'm gonna say the dad from I'm gonna say Alan from Boy Meets
Mm,
World is the only one I can think of off the top of my head, honestly. And he loved Corey and Eric quite fiercely, and Sean because he adopted Sean. Um,
mm.
yeah, so I'll say Boy Meets World. Because Brighton and Mr. Sheffield never really saw eye to eye on anything that I can think of. So
No. They had some few moments, but yeah, if we think about it, it they were very minor in comparison to Fran and Max, who were pretty much the driving relationship of the show.
yeah.
The kid as the show got on, the kids have very much got sidelined into supporting extras.
Uh,
Um,
yes, we haven't done a full episode on the nanny yet, which we should probably do next year.
mm,
Because I think it would probably
yeah,
behoove us to do that. But yes, yeah,
yeah.
there's just not a lot. Can you think of something in like
S-
BBC or anything you can think of that would be that I've missed? Because I'm trying to
I
think of anything, and now I'm like, what has there been? Really?
I'm struggling off the top of my head to come up with something. I would probably have to sit down and have a
Yeah.
serious think about it to come up with strong examples. The the nearest examples I can think of that come close to this are various sort of like coming of age stories from that period of American and British cinema, where it is focused on maybe like a young man is growing up and such and has like a supportive father or a father
Yeah.
figure that they come to understand and such in some manner. You'll see it in a number of productions. I feel really bad that I'm not coming up with any names at the minute. But my point is, I think that's the closest it comes to it. But you never see it in the context that it's clearly the love a son has for his father that helps to come that win the day against an evil force. I mean, the ones I'm talking about are very much dramas or coming of age stories, not sort of like a supernatural thriller
Yeah.
like this is. And I think that's what makes it even more of a rarer um thing. I believe that we've gone in a positive direction where it's becoming a lot more open and a much more of a thing where non-romantic loving relationships
Oh
help to
wait,
save.
I do have one.
Oh,
I
go
can
ahead.
think of one actually. Um,
Ooh,
Jay and Manny from Modern Family. The
ah,
portrayal of Ed O'Neill's portrayal of Jay is incredible over the course of the series, how he learns to have compassion and open up to his family. And
mm,
Manny is a big part of that. It's Manny comes in as this almost hyper mature kid who acts like an old man, and they sort of swing back into each other in a really great way. So I would say that I would almost say if it was a little bit of a bigger part, the King and the ABC Cinderella Victor Garber Paolo Montalban, because
mm,
Victor Garber gives Paolo permission to go against what Whoopi Goldberg's Queen wants for him. But yeah, in the world of fantastic, you don't get much of that. Like Rockadoodle Doo is about a kid going on a journey by himself against evil owls, which is a weird, phenomenal movie. But yeah, you don't really see it much in fantasy. Ray Bradbury always does something very special in my mind, and that
mm.
includes this. So
You thinking of a related thing, and on this also relates to the concept of like how times have changed and such. Um, the concept of like true love's kiss and everything, it was always portrayed in the past as being between romantic partners and such. But what we're seeing now is more examples when it comes, it's being subverted. And what it means is more of an act of love that's given by a loved one that selfishly helps save the day. So in Once Upon a Time, um, it was shown a few times. It was between mother and a son that helped to save the day.
yeah,
Maleficent, it wasn't Philip that kissed Aurora in the live action movie that saved the day. It, it was Maleficent's gentle kiss on the forehead that woke up Aurora from Maleficent's own curse, the love between adoptive mother and her daughter. And I am really liking this. I know it's a bit cheesy at times, but I'm
no,
really
Cheese was
liking this.
good.
It's showing the power of love, and I think that's such a great way also coming back round to something wicked that shows the strength of love that helps overcome temptation and seduction to keep to yourself rather than be like, reeled in by the dark, as
I
it were.
mean, yeah, and also even in the midst of the terrifying things that were in the shadows, the heart of something wicked is love. And I think that's a perfect place to end, even though we're doing some childhood nightmare fuel movies. I'm very excited to talk about yours next time, but we have less than a minute left on the episode. So I'll
Oh
make sure
yes.
we say thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you with another edition of Everything is Gay, even the straight stuff. Stay spooky.
Bye.